This video is an introduction to the WARBL Configuration Tool, which is a web page that connects to WARBL and is used for changing the settings on the device. On iOS devices, iPhones and iPads, you'll use the free WARBL app to access the configuration tool. On other devices, you'll use a Chrome web browser, then go to the WARBL web page and in the menu click Configure WARBL to open the configuration tool. For this video, I'll be using the WARBL app on an iPad, but the configuration tool looks almost identical on other devices. I'm going to open the WARBL app on my iPad. And I haven't plugged the WARBL in yet because I wanted to show you what it looks like when the WARBL isn't connected. It says WARBL not detected here in WARBL firmware version unknown. Now I'm going to plug the WARBL in. You can also do this before you open the app, and it should connect automatically in that case. Now I've plugged my WARBL in and I'm going to click Connect to WARBL. You'll see that now it tells us the WARBL firmware version and says that the firmware is up to date. So this is how you know that the WARBL is connected. If the firmware on the WARBL itself happens to be an older version, it will tell you here that there is a firmware update available. And there's information in the user manual about how to update the firmware. If the firmware on your WARBL isn't up to date, there may be some controls in the configuration tool that aren't available to you or are disabled. The configuration tool changes depending on which firmware version you have installed. When we connect to the configuration tool, all of the current settings in the WARBL are downloaded to the tool. It's important to know that the settings are saved in the WARBL itself, not in the configuration tool. So that for normal playing, you don't necessarily need to open the configuration tool. It's just used for changing settings in the WARBL. You'll notice these yellow info buttons in various parts of the tool. If you click on one of these, it will give you information about how to use that particular part of the tool. The next thing to notice is that there are 3 different tabs along the top representing 3 different instruments. The instruments are a group of settings and an associated fingering pattern. The idea with this is that you have 3 different configurations that you can quickly access without having to adjust individual settings. So for example, by default, WARBL is set up with a tin whistle flute configuration, an uilleann pipes configuration, and a Scottish bagpipes configuration. Later we'll see how to switch between these by using a button on the WARBL. You'll see that currently instrument 1 is set as the default instrument, so that anytime you plug WARBL in, it will turn on using the instrument 1 group of settings. To change to another default instrument, you can click Set as Default here. So after I've done that, the next time I plug WARBL in, it will be using all the settings in the Instrument 2 tab. If I scroll down to the bottom of the app, you'll see there's a separate section for optical sensor calibration. I've covered calibration in a separate video, so I won't discuss it here, but I did just want to point out that when you calibrate the sensors, it applies to all 3 instruments. There's not a separate calibration for each instrument. If you're using the configuration tool on something other than an iOS device, so for example PC, Mac, or Android, you'll see another section at the bottom here for importing and exporting presets. You can use this to save the settings for the currently selected instrument to a text file that you can later load back in and install on your WARBL. Now we'll take a look at some of the settings for each instrument. Up here at the top you can choose the fingering pattern that you want to use. On the WARBL website, on the documentation page, there are diagrams of all these fingering charts. If you choose one of these, you may see that the key changes automatically. You can also change the key manually. The key is chosen by default based on the most common key for the actual acoustic instrument that you've chosen. In most cases, if you want to play in a different key, you won't need to change this. You'll usually change it in the MIDI app you're using to produce the actual sound. There's also an option to use a custom fingering chart. If you go all the way down to the bottom of the drop-down menu and choose Custom, you can then click Configure Custom. And this is the basic tin whistle fingering chart, but you have the option to change the MIDI note numbers for each of the fingering patterns in the chart. There are also a few more advanced settings. If you've made a change to the custom fingering chart, you'll then want to click Save Settings for Current Instrument and click OK. This is also true of any other settings for each instrument. If you want them to be saved in the WARBL itself, you'll have to click Save Settings for Current Instrument. There's also an option to apply settings to all instruments, we'll just copy all the settings from the current instrument, in this case instrument 1, to the other two instruments. This can be useful if you want to create 3 similar instruments. You can just create 3 with all the same settings and then tweak a few if you want to. There's also an option to restore all factory settings, which will also restore the original tone hole calibration. Let's look at the vibrato and slide panel. By default, WARBL has vibrato only turned on, so by lowering a finger over a tone hole, you can play vibrato. There's also an option to use slide and vibrato. Slide or glissando is when you lower a finger gradually. It will lower the note gradually to the next lowest note on the scale, or vice versa. There's also an option to have no pitch bend at all. Or there's a legato slide vibrato, which is a little bit more advanced. It basically allows you to blend multiple notes together without changing to different MIDI notes. Typically, most players will use vibrato or no pitch bend on faster tunes and possibly slide and vibrato, or the legato slide and vibrato option on slower tunes. The finger sensing distance represents how far away from the tone holes your fingers will be sensed when you're using pitch bend. If this is set to its maximum, the tone holes can detect your fingers about 1 centimeter away. If you're having trouble playing notes cleanly without accidentally having some slide and vibrato happen, you may want to reduce this finger sensing distance a little bit so your fingers aren't detected so far away from the instrument. The vibrato depth is how much pitch bend occurs when you're using vibrato. So if I increase this vibrato depth to a maximum of 50 cents, this is what it sounds like. The default, I believe, is around 13, which is a little bit more subtle vibrato. At the bottom here, you can select which holes are used for vibrato. Clicking them so they turn black will turn off those holes so that no vibrato will be triggered by covering those holes. For some fingering patterns like tin whistle, uilleann pipes, and Highland bagpipes, there may be a custom vibrato option available. If you turn that on, it's designed to more closely mimic how vibrato works on the actual instrument. You'll notice with that turned on, you will no longer be able to select the vibrato holes. The holes that are available for vibrato are hard-coded into the custom vibrato algorithm for each instrument. Next, let's look at the note trigger and register control panel. These settings control how WARBL triggers notes and also changes registers or octaves. The default setting for this is overblowing, which is how in a tin whistle or Irish flute or uilleann bagpipes, for example, blowing harder jumps to a second octave. You can also choose single register if you just want to play in a single octave. You can choose thumb register if you want to use your left thumb to control which octave you're playing in. If you're using a fingering pattern where the thumb is already used by default, then this option won't be available to you. If you are using the thumb register control, you can click this invert thumb bell switch to change whether lifting the thumb or lowering the thumb moves you to the second octave. If you have the bell sensor, you can also use that for changing octaves. And again, the invert switch changes whether covering or uncovering the bell sensor moves to a higher octave. If you're using the newer WARBL mouthpiece, you'll want to have this vented mouthpiece switch turned on. This basically just makes it so that it requires less pressure to switch octaves. Because the mouthpiece lets air escape, it's not as sensitive to pressure changes as, for example, the closed bagpipe bag or a closed tube for the mouthpiece. This calibrated startup option, which is selected by default, means that every time you plug in WARBL, the pressure sensor will be calibrated to the surrounding air pressure. Then notes will be triggered at just a slightly higher pressure than that surrounding air pressure, so if you blow just gently into the mouthpiece, it'll trigger notes. That doesn't work as well with a bagpipe bag, because the bag is much more effective at applying air pressure to the pressure sensor, so you want to have it trigger notes at a much higher pressure than the mouthpiece. If you're using the bag, you want to use this option instead, the Learn or Enter Pressure setting. Once you've clicked that, you can squeeze the bagpipe bag at approximately the pressure where you want to trigger notes, and then click Learn. And you'll see a value be automatically entered into this field based on how hard you were squeezing the bagpipe bag. Now, assuming you've saved your settings, next time you plug in WARBL, this number will reappear and notes will be triggered at that pressure. You can also manually enter a value into this field if you'd prefer to do that. Some bagpipe players may want to be able to trigger notes without having to use a bag or a mouthpiece at all. In that case, you can use Bagless mode, which allows you to set a button to start playing and then just use your fingers to change notes without having to use the bag or the mouthpiece. If you've selected Bagless mode, you'll also have to assign a button to start and stop the sound, which I'll cover in a few minutes after we get to the button behavior panel down below. There are a couple of other things in this panel. Down here is just a pressure monitor, which shows the current air pressure on the pressure sensor. And here you can have a graph of the pressure over time. There are also some advanced settings. If you click that, it changes to an advanced panel, and here you'll see the separate settings for the closed versus the vented mouthpiece. So if you have the vented switch turned on, it'll be using these settings over here. If you have that switch turned off, which you would want to do if you're using a closed bagpipe bag, it'll be using these settings over here. You can also use these buttons to restore default settings for either breath or the bagpipe bag. And if you are using the bag, you'll want to go in here and click Bag Defaults, and that will use these new settings for the bag. The main difference is that it will require a higher pressure to jump octaves, giving you more control over register changes when you're using the bagpipe bag. You can just click OK to get out of this panel and move back to the regular panel. Moving down, we'll look at the expression panel. And a lot of this is for more advanced users, so I'm just going to mention a few things here. There may be another video delving deeper into this panel later on. Most beginning WARBL users will want to have this force max velocity switch turned on. This makes it so that WARBL sends MIDI notes with the maximum velocity of 127, which will be interpreted by most MIDI apps as maximum volume setting. So to get the most volume out of simple MIDI apps like Celtic Sounds, for example, you want to have this switch turned on. This pitch expression switch is turned off by default. If it's turned on, it will add a little bit of pitch bend to notes based on pressure, so that if you're applying pressure at the low end of a range for a given note, it'll slightly flatten the note, and then if you apply more pressure, it'll bring the note into sort of its in-tune range, and then increased pressure will sharpen it a little bit. This is intended to mimic how real instruments have a central pressure range for each note where the note is in tune, and then the pitch drops off or sharpens a little bit based on the pressure above or below that range. It just adds a little bit of realism to the notes. Moving this pitch expression depth slider just changes the amount of pitch bend that is applied based on the pressure. These settings down below are mostly for more advanced users, but they allow you to send various MIDI messages based on pressure. You can send, for example, a CC message and then map the input pressure to the output range of the CC messages. Now looking at the drones control panel, this is for bagpipe players who want to be able to use WARBL to turn drones in MIDI apps on or off. Bagpipe apps like Celtic Sounds, MIDI Module, or Universal Piper, or ePipes, for example, respond to certain MIDI messages in order to turn samples of bagpipe drones on and off. Now these messages can be MIDI notes, or they can be CC messages. If they're MIDI notes, they don't necessarily correspond to the note of the drones themselves. It's just a message, and it can be any MIDI message depending on the app. If you look at the documentation for the particular app, for example, Celtic Sounds and the iOS store has a list of MIDI messages that it responds to for turning drones and also regulators for uilleann pipes on or off. These default settings are for the Celtic Sounds app. Celtic Sounds responds to a MIDI note on command to turn the drones on, and also another note on command to turn the drones off, which can be a bit confusing for some people. Other apps might respond to a note on command to turn the drones on and a note off command to turn the note off. Again, it just depends on the app. And in some apps like Universal Piper, you can customize the MIDI messages that are used for controlling drones, and also a lot of other features in that app. Here you can see the MIDI channel that is used for the messages. And then byte 2 is the number of the MIDI note, and byte 3 is typically the velocity of the note. In apps like Celtic Sounds, this byte 3 is used to control the volume of the drone. So changing this anywhere from 0 to 127 will change the volume of the drones with the Celtic Sounds app. This bottom section controls how you will turn the drones on and off using the WARBL. Right now, no drone control is selected. If I select Use Secret Button, now if I cover only the right index finger hole and press button number 1 at the same time, that will turn the drones on, and then doing the same thing again will turn the drones off again. That's a convenient way to control the drones. If I select Turn On/Off with Chanter, anytime I play a note with the chanter, the drones will automatically turn on. When I stop playing a note, the drones will turn themselves off again. This last option, Use Pressure, will use a set pressure from the bag to turn the drones on and off. So a bagpipe player, for example, might want to use a low pressure for starting the drones, then a slightly higher pressure for starting the chanter. So up here right now we have 4.3 set for triggering notes on the chanter. We could set a slightly lower pressure, maybe 3, for example, for the drones. Or again, you could squeeze the bag at whatever pressure you want to use and click Learn to use that pressure for turning the drones on and then turning them off again as you drop below that pressure. There is one more option for turning the drones on and off, which is to assign a button to do that. And we'll talk about that next when we get down into the button behavior panel. If we're going to do that, we would just want to click No Drone Control up here, and then we'll learn how to assign a button to control the drones. The button behavior panel lets you assign button actions to WARBL commands. So on the left side here you see a series of actions. Click 1 means when you click button 1, which is the top button on the WARBL, clicking button 2, which is the second button, and then button 3 is the bottom button. If you click button 1, it'll do this action that you have selected in this top drop-down menu. Farther down, there are button combinations. So for example, if you hold down button 2 and click button 1, it'll do this action that you've selected here. And then long press, if you hold button 1 down for a few seconds, it'll do this action down here. The long presses are good for actions that you might not need very often and that you don't want to accidentally do, but if you happen to accidentally click one of the buttons. If it is a problem accidentally clicking buttons, and sometimes people will be used to putting their thumb in a certain place on the back of their instrument, if that thumb is inadvertently clicking buttons, you can always just assign a button to none, which means it won't have any action if you inadvertently click that button. So looking at the actions that you can assign a button to, the top one is sending a MIDI message. So this is typically for advanced users if they have a MIDI app that responds to certain messages, for example, to change controls within the app. You can send a variety of MIDI messages, note on-off messages, CC program change messages, and then you can enter values over here for those messages. Again, that's typically for more advanced users. But an example of that is using MIDI messages to control regulators in the Celtic Sounds app. This change slide and vibrato action corresponds to the slide vibrato selection up here. So this is why these have numbers assigned to them. If you've assigned a button to cycle through these, each time you click the button, it'll go to the next one. And the LED in the warble will blink a number of times corresponding to the number of the current selection. So if you are, for example, on slide and vibrato mode, and then you click a button once and change to vibrato mode, the LED will blink twice, indicating that you're in that mode, etc. The change instrument action cycles through the 3 instrument tabs. So if you have a button click assigned to change instrument, when you click the button, it'll cycle from the current instrument to the next one. And again, the LED in the warble will blink according to the number of the instrument that's selected. So if you cycled to instrument 2, it'll blink twice. If you're on instrument 3, it'll blink 3 times. Now, I want to mention something important here, which is that if you assign a button to switch instruments, you need to do that same thing for all 3 instruments. In other words, if you assign a button in instrument 1 to switch to instrument 2, you also need to assign the same button action in instrument 2 to switch instruments. Otherwise, you can get stuck in an instrument. So if you assign a button and you use that button to switch to instrument 2, but you don't have the same button assignment in instrument 2, you'll be stuck. You won't be able to use a button to switch to instrument 3 and then back to instrument 1 again. So you have to remember that the button assignments are specific to each instrument. So this is sort of a unique case where you can use a button assignment to then move to a whole different set of button assignments. So in this case, you need to make sure you do the same button assignment for all 3 instruments. Now, play stop bagless mode. This is where I mentioned earlier, if you have bagless mode selected, you need to assign a button to turn the sound on and off. So if I've done this, when I click button 1, it will make the sound start playing. If I click it again, it will stop the sound, assuming that we have the bagless mode switch turned on up here in the note trigger and register control panel. Now this octave shift up and octave shift down lets you shift the entire range of the warble. So for example, when I have this set like this, if I click button 1, it'll move the entire range up an octave. If I click it again, it'll move it up another octave. If I turn this momentary switch on, then it's just a momentary change. So in other words, it'll only shift the octave up while I have the button 1 held down. When I release the button, it'll shift the range back down an octave. The same thing with octave shift down. If I have the momentary switch turned on and if I hold down button 1, it'll shift the octave down. If I release the button, it'll shift it up again. The same thing is true of this semitone shift up and down. If I don't have that momentary switch turned on, that will be a permanent change. If I click button 1, it'll shift up a semitone. If I click it again, it'll shift up another semitone. But if I want it to just be temporary, momentary, if I hold button down, it'll shift the semitone up. This is a good way to play accidentals if you just want to play one note that's, a half step higher, semitone higher. You can just hold down button 1, play the note, and then release it again. Next we have the MIDI Panic option. This will send MIDI messages turning off all the notes that are currently playing. Every once in a while with the MIDI app, a note will get stuck on, which means it won't stop playing when it's supposed to. The MIDI Panic command will turn all of the currently playing MIDI notes off. So this is a good option to have if you're in a performance, for example, and there's a chance that a note might get stuck on. And with certain apps, that's more likely to happen than others. So if you've noticed a tendency for your MIDI app to have stuck notes, you may want to have a button assigned to MIDI Panic. The change register control mode cycles through these are the register control modes. So again, if you have a button assigned to this, it'll cycle through these 4 settings, and the LED on the WARBL will blink corresponding to the number of these settings. Now this turn drones on off is where, if you just want to assign a button command to controlling the drones, instead of using one of these options here, you'll just select no drone control and then select a button action to turning the drones on and off. So right here I've selected clicking button number 1 to turn the drones on, and then clicking it again to turn the drones off again. And the final option is begin auto calibration. If you want to be able to calibrate the WARBL sensors, tone hole sensors, without going into the configuration tool, you could set a button action to start the auto calibration routine. Now this isn't something you want to assign to just clicking a button because it would be too easy to do this accidentally. You could assign it, for example, to a long press, possibly, so that if you hold down button 3 for a few seconds, in this case, it'll start the auto calibration. Or you may want to do it, you may want to assign it to a combination of buttons. You want it to be something that won't be easy to inadvertently do, because that will, it's not a good idea to auto calibrate if you're not expecting it, because it will completely ruin your sensor calibration. Up at the top here, you can click this button to bring up the MIDI Console, which will show you the MIDI messages that are currently being sent by the WARBL. This is good for troubleshooting. And then finally there's a switch for using secret button commands, and these are a few hard-coded commands that are assigned to combinations of covering tone holes and buttons, and you can get more information on those by clicking the little info button here in the button behavior panel. So that's it for the overview of the configuration tool. Hopefully that has answered some of the questions that people will have, but feel free to get in touch either by email or on the WARBL forum or Facebook if you have more questions about WARBL.